God in heaven, we thank you for this day of grace that's now drawing to a close. We've had a day. It's been a good one, a gift from you. We thank you for the forgiveness that you gave us in the morning. We thank you for the grace that you give us now at night. We thank you for the protection that your angels provided and the care that your loving hand gave us all day long. Tonight, as we sit at your feet, Jesus, and hear your word and ponder your grace to your people Israel and your grace to your people who we are still today, fill our hearts with great hope and comfort because of who you are and because of what your word tells us about you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. You've probably heard it before, haven't you? That our God hides himself. Surely you are a God who hides himself. Luther is known to have said that God wears masks. That how does God normally do his work in the world? He does his work in this world through masks. So how does God provide law? You've heard of police or ambulance, right? How does God provide care for people? How does God provide protection to his people? Armed forces, police, ambulance. How does God provide so that our country isn't in chaos? Well, we have a system that God has given us to provide so that it's not as chaotic as it could be. It's not anarchy. It's whether we like our system of government or not, God's given us order, and that's a good thing. This is the way that God cares for his people. And it's hard, I think, this is what I'm getting to, it's hard, I think, sometimes for us because God wears masks. Because God wears a mask, what don't we always get to see? And what don't we always realize? If God is almost always wearing a mask, if God is almost always hiding himself behind people, or in the sacraments, water and wine and bread and preachers, if God is always hiding himself, what do we never get to see? This is the Bible class part.
We forget God's in charge.
We forget that God's in charge. We forget that God's doing it. We don't see his face. We forget that God, even when we can't see him, is doing stuff. So I want to just ponder with you just some Bible truths about God that we don't ever get to see. Just throw some at me. What are some things that you know about God, some characteristics of God that you don't normally see? Love. Don't normally see God's love. Okay? What else? Forgiveness. You do something wrong, where do you see God? God doesn't come and say, I forgive you. He hides behind a person, or maybe not even a person in his word.
His presence.
Okay. God says he's here. Where? Power. Yeah. We don't see him, like feeding the 5,000 with that and me to be in that crowd, and all of a sudden he's just, here's some bread. However that happened. Here's some fish. What else? We could do this a lot. His care. You don't see, you experience it, but you don't always see or think about God caring for you. Huh?
Nurturing.
The way he nurtures us like a father his child. Huh? Yeah. We pray and we pray and we pray, but it sometimes feels like, at least, we're talking to a brick wall. Is he hearing what we're saying? Is he hearing us? Is he seeing us? Is he watching us? Is he caring? These are all things that God says he is. I'm the God who hears. Call to me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you. He says that. It's hidden, though. I'm what? I'm the God who sees you, he says to Hagar. Remember what she called him, the God who sees? Sometimes it feels like we're doing we feel like kids. Like, Dad, are you watching? There are a lot. The one that we want to look at tonight as we come to the Exodus is he is the God who watches. And we're going to dig into that idea, this truth that God is the God who watches. It's more than just looking at us. It's more than God sitting in his lifeguard saying, just observing you in the pool. And I want to show that to you. It is a truth. Do you know Psalm 121? I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. If you look at that psalm later on, I'm just going to highlight it for you real quick. If you look at this psalm, this is a psalm that actually says 6 times in the psalm, God says, I'm the God who watches over you. He actually declares that this is true. So how do we know if we don't ever see it? Here's the next question. How do we know if we don't ever see it that it's true? How do we know? That's not a good enough reason. Just do. Yeah. That's why I share Psalm 121, because if you want to know if God is the God who watches, let me just skim through it. It's God said so. Okay, you'll recognize this as I go through it. He says, verse 3, he will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you, that's 1, will not slumber. Verse 4, he who watches over Israel will not slumber or sleep. How cool is that? That God does not sleep on the job. Ever. Verse 5, the Lord watches over you. Verse 7, the Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. All of those are the same verb, by the way. Watching. And we're going to dig into that word. Verse 8, the Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forevermore. This is the theological truth how do I know God watches? Because Psalm 121 tells me so. And there's a section we're going to read from Exodus. We get to see God do it. Now think, as I read this, you think about this from Israel's perspective. Do you think they knew God was watching? You think? They should have. But if you're, this is the thought that goes through my mind as I read this account. They're going through all these plagues and God's doing all these miraculous things. And I wonder, as the Egyptians are basically at this point kicking them out, get out of here because all our boys are dead because of your God, get out of here. I wonder if there's a little bit of panic and a little bit of worry and a little bit of fear. If you keep reading into chapter 13, 14 in Exodus, you definitely see fear. But what do we see as we get into this? Madeline, would you just follow along there? Exodus chapter 12. This is right on the heels. This is right on the heels of the last plague. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites, go. Worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go. And also bless me." Kind of a weird request. Bless me. I've been so mean to you, and now bless me. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in eating troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them and also drove large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Now, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt, because the Lord kept vigil. There's that word watch, because the Lord watched. Because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. It's that last verse that I want to think with you about. because the Lord kept vigil, and it's the same word as Psalm 121, because the Lord watched that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for generations to come. So because God watched, dear people, you should watch. So think about this with me. What does it mean when turn around and sit, please. You're distracting me. I can't imagine about what you're doing to everyone else. What do you think? What is it? What do you understand when God says the Lord watched his people? What was he watching? What was he doing? What does it mean? Just dig into this with me. What does it mean when God calls himself the God who watches his people, who kept vigil that night?
Protecting.
Okay, so part of God watching his people is what? He's guarding them from Pharaoh and his people. Because in the not too far distant future, what's Pharaoh going to do? He's coming after him, and so what does God do? He comes behind. Well, first it comes behind him as the pillar of fire and cloud, and then he parts the sea that they get to go through. So part of God watching is God making sure he's watching over his people to make sure they're safe, like a shepherd watches his sheep. What else does it mean? What else is God doing when he watches? He knows when you've been naughty. He knows when you've been nice. Okay? So for maybe not so much in the Exodus account, he's watching to make sure they're doing the right thing, but for us to know that God is always watching our behavior, our words, our thoughts, our actions, that's not so comforting. What else does it mean?
You're also under his wings for protecting me.
So you think of the hymn or Psalm 91. Under his wings you will find refuge. So God watching to protect like a mother hen, to shelter. What else?
Watching over our soul.
Okay. Making sure not just body is safe, but souls are safe. What's good for them?
He watches to see what we need as well.
Yeah.
He's watching to give us what we need.
Provide. So there's providing care here. In God's are my people okay? Are they going to be okay? What's going to be good for their bodies? What's going to be especially good for their soul? What else? Go ahead.
So if he watches it, if he knows everything, why does he have to watch?
The question is, if he knows everything, what does he have to watch?
I mean, he would know what we need without watching it.
To let us know he's there.
But we don't see him watching.
No, but it says here. So maybe we'll take more care of what we say, what we do, and how we act.
But I don't think, when I think about this, I don't think that when we hear God say, there are some times when the Bible says God's watching you, and that's scary, that the Bible intends it to be an ominous, fear-invoking thing. But I don't know, at least here in Exodus, when God says, the Lord kept vigil, I don't think God's watching his people to see if they stumbled on the way out of Egypt. I mean, why would God have to watch his people if they're coming out of Egypt? If he knows exactly what they need, if he knows what Pharaoh's going to do, if he knows all this stuff, why would God have to watch? Why would God have to stay awake and keep vigil?
Because he wants to give us Jesus.
Yeah. Because he wants to give us Jesus. So in the Exodus, what is God especially watching over?
His Lord.
Yeah. So as you think about this, I put these up ahead of time, but God is watching his covenant. And you get a hint of that covenant. Did you catch it? You maybe missed it because it just, all the words run together, but in verse 40 or 41, did you notice how there's this reference to the 430 years? To the it's very exact, to the very day. Do you know what that's a reference to?
Did you say?
In Exodus 12, 40, 41, he says, on the 430th day, like exactly 430 years, what's day one? Huh?
Next time.
Well, it's before, so we're going back in history, backwards. Genesis 15.
We're starting messing up.
No. Genesis 15, Abraham, God makes a promise to Abraham that in Genesis it's 400 years. But your children will be exiles in Egypt for 400 years, and then you'll come back. It's interesting to read the commentaries about why 400 years in Genesis and 430 years in Exodus. I'm not worried about that, because God's good. And His Word is perfect, so Moses writes this down because he wants us to know God is concerned about His covenant, which is really about Jesus. It's a little detail in the text that you read it. What's going on? But God is telling us these 430 years to the very day. It's a very exact comment because He wants us to know this is about my promise about Jesus. And I suppose you could say God doesn't have to watch because He knows what we need. But, I don't have to watch my kids to know I don't have to see them to know they're okay or not okay. But,
Yes, you do.
well, my kids I do. Maybe not your kids.
Anybody's kids, you got to watch them.
But, doesn't it comfort you to know that Dad's watching? It depends if you're being good or not. But now look at the other detail. If you look at it, God is counting His people. Did you notice that? All the host of Israel is coming out. So you read a section like that, and you remember some of the other promises God has made. What does Jesus say about His sheep? I will not lose any of the sheep God has given me. Or in what we read in John 6 tonight, my Father's will is this, that I will lose none of those the Father has given me. So God is counting sheep, not because He's sleepy and wants to go to sleep, but because He wants to make sure that none of them are missing.
And that's a huge comfort. That He's
Huge.
watching.
That He's like, where's Vicky? Or where's whoever, right? God cares that much about me that He's watching to make sure I'm still there. God is watching their footsteps. This is the whole safety thing. But it's Psalm 18 where God talks about, where the Psalm of David talks about God making our footsteps firm, making the path beneath our feet broad. It's the difference between walking on a narrow edge on the side of a mountain and riding on a broad highway. Because God is watching us, we're walking on a broad highway, not on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall off. And God is watching every footstep that we take. Because what does God want for His people Israel? What does God want for you, His people? Not
Keep us safe.
keep us safe in soul. Not just to get out of Egypt, but to get to the promised land in heaven. So He watches our every step. And so now we keep vigil. People who watch their God. So it's a little different than when God watches us, because now our vigil is different. Because we're watching, the people of Israel were watching God for a different reason. When the people of Israel kept vigil, what were they to be doing? Okay, so they're looking ahead, a vigil of expectation, because they're looking ahead to see what God's going to do next. The people of Israel were looking back at Egypt and scared of Pharaoh, but it would have been cool if they'd been looking ahead to say, God, you've done some pretty cool stuff. What are you going to do next? Okay, what else? That's actually number 3 on my list, so I can't put up 1 and 2 yet.
Just to keep our eyes on God and focus on.
Keep our eyes up on God and His promises. That's my first one. Keep your eyes on the promises. Isn't that vigil? Watch and pray so that you may not fall into temptation. Eyes on the... Again, it's about the covenant, isn't it? How do I know God's going to be with me? How do I know that God's purpose for me is heaven? that his purposes for me are good and saving? Well, because he promises it's so. Eyes up in prayer. Vigil, watching, is always combined with word and prayer. They go together. Eyes on the promises, eyes up in prayer. And then eyes forward in hope. Instead of looking back at the things that scare us, instead of looking back and wondering if God's with us, look ahead, because God is with you. His word tells you so, even if you can't see him. God is watching you, even though he doesn't have to. He is watching you to guard and keep us all the way, to make sure that none of us get lost, to make the path broad beneath our feet, to protect us, to provide for us, to do what's good for us. And so, coming full circle to the question I started with, we don't see it, not always. Sometimes it feels like we're on the edge of the cliff and the path is pretty narrow. How do we know that it's not? Because God says so. And a story like this, where God says, where there's this simple little verse, the Lord kept vigil as his people came out of Egypt. It's a simple little line like that that's, I don't know if they saw that, but I do. And it helps me remember, yeah, God's doing that for me too. And that's a good thing for us to remember, that God, our God is a God who watches us. Amen.